Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with entertainment and the announcement from the Walt Disney Company that ABC's Jimmy Kimmel Live will be back on air tonight. The show was suspended last week after comments from the late-night host about the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Two station owners, Nexstar and Sinclair, said they would preempt Kimmel indefinitely. Sinclair says it plans to keep airing news programming instead of Kimmel's show while it continues talks with ABC. Bloomberg's Chris Palmieri says questions remain about Kimmel's future.
There have been discussions at the highest level, we understand, from Disney CEO Bob Iger and Dana Walden, the head of TV, directly with Jimmy Kimmel himself over, what the future would hold. Right now, we don't have any details in terms of what he's going to say on Tuesday, but part of that has, there have been calls from some of the station owners for him to apologize to Charlie Kirk's family, even make a donation.
Bloomberg's Chris Palmieri says Disney contends it had thoughtful conversations with Kimmel. Sources say the host will address the controversy when he takes the stage tonight. Jimmy Kimmel's contract with Disney expires next May.
Well, Nathan, we turn to Washington now. The Trump administration is advising pregnant women to avoid taking Tylenol, citing fears over autism. And Bloomberg's Amy Morris has more from the nation's capital.
The FDA recommends pregnant women talk to their doctors about any risks of taking Tylenol during their pregnancy. President Trump.
Acetaminophen, which is basically commonly known as Tylenol, during pregnancy can be associated with a very increased risk of autism.
Now, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. promised earlier this year to determine the cause of autism by September. That baffled brain experts who say there is no single cause and that the rhetoric appears to ignore decades of science into the genetic and environmental factors that can play a role. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Amy, thank you. President Trump is now in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. He'll deliver the first address of his second term to the annual gathering of world leaders this morning. He has a raft of meetings with world leaders, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. The White House announced earlier this month that it would use this year's General Assembly to push other countries to adopt more restrictions on asylum. The president is also expected to touch on Israel's war in Gaza. Several nations have recognized a Palestinian state at this conference.
And Nathan, as global leaders flow into New York this week, some countries could look to upgrade their airline fleets. Transactions involving Boeing are by now a common feature of President Trump's visits with foreign leaders. Several countries, including Turkey, Morocco, and Indonesia, are considering or have announced orders for Boeing aircrafts. Through August, the plane maker had secured 725 aircraft sales versus 600 for Airbus, putting Boeing on track to outperform its European rival for the first full year since 2021. And looking at Boeing shares this morning, up about 1.9%.
We're also watching a couple of AI giants. Karen, Nvidia plans to invest $100 billion in OpenAI, a deal that underlines booming demand for artificial intelligence tools like ChatGPT. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang discussed the partnership on CNBC.
There's never been an engineering project, a technical project of this complexity and this scale ever. And it really just says that AI was in the early adopter phase in the labs, and finally it's breaking out into just about every single industry, every single use case we can imagine.
And alongside Jensen Huang, OpenAI CEO Sam Altman said it's critical to their goals.
Now that we really see what's on the near-term horizon of how good the models are getting, the new use cases that are being enabled, what people want to do, this is like the fuel that we need to drive improvement, to drive better models, to drive revenue, everything.
Sam Altman and Jensen Huang spoke on CNBC to mark the deal. It is the latest and largest in a string of investments by NVIDIA. This tie-up will fund new data centers and infrastructure equipped with NVIDIA's advanced chips.
Let's check the economy now, Nathan. And we heard from Fed Governor Stephen Miron yesterday in his first policy speech since joining the central bank. Miron says interest rates should be much lower to avoid economic damage. His view on rates aligns with President Trump, but he told Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsen he's not directly influenced by the president.
He's never asked me to set policy in a specific way. He's never asked me. It's never happened. I view my job as trying to provoke an interesting discussion that will help the FOMC arrive at clear understandings of the way the economy works and where monetary policy should be set.
And speaking at the Economic Club of New York, Fed Governor Stephen Miron also argued that the neutral rate has been pushed lower by tariffs, immigration restrictions, and tax policy.
And back in Washington, Karen, Bloomberg News has learned congressional Democrats plan to meet with President Trump this week to discuss ways to keep the government operating as an October 1st shutdown deadline draws closer. Sources tell us the meeting will happen on Thursday. A White House spokesperson has declined to comment. President Trump has said he thinks a shutdown is likely, but is willing to meet Democrats.
Well, overseas, Nathan, Hong Kong issued its third highest storm warning as Super Typhoon Gaza tracks toward the area. The typhoon's packing sustained winds of 137 miles per hour, according to the local weather agency. That's equivalent to a Category 4 hurricane. Gaza has caused major flight disruptions and suspension of school classes and business activities across southern China after skirting northern Philippines.
And finally, Karen, Argentina has received a commitment from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He's pledging to provide all options for stabilization to President Javier Milei to keep the country from falling back into crisis. Leaders are rushing to contain a massive sell-off in Argentina's financial markets ahead of midterm elections next month. Options for stabilization include currency swap lines, direct currency repurchases, and U.S. dollar-denominated debt from the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. The announcement from Treasury Secretary Bessent calmed investors and prompted a rebound in Argentina's assets after the central bank in the country burned through more than $1 billion in foreign reserves.
It is time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The White House stands behind border czar Tom Homan following reports that he had accepted $50,000 from undercover agents posing as business people during an undercover FBI operation last year. It led to a bribery investigation that was said to be shut down by the Trump administration Justice Department. At the White House press briefing, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt denied the allegations.
The White House and the president stand by Tom Homan 100% because he did absolutely nothing wrong, and he is a brave public servant who has done a phenomenal job in helping the president shut down the border.
Spokesperson Leavitt characterized Homan's encounter with the undercover agents as an effort by the Biden administration to entrap one of the president's top allies and supporters. The Supreme Court says it will review a 90-year-old ruling that restricts a president from firing members of the Federal Trade Commission. The case could have major ramifications for presidential power over what have traditionally been considered independent agencies. For now, the Supreme Court says the president can move forward with the firing of Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic member of the FTC, first appointed in 2018. The court's 3 liberal justices opposed it. Arguments on that are expected in December. Out today, U.S. News and World Report's best colleges list. Lamont Jones is managing editor for education.
Number 1 is Princeton and the 2026 edition. Number 2 is MIT, followed by Harvard at 3, and then a tie at 4 between Stanford and Yale.
Lamont Jones says while U.S. News will be watching for how the Trump administration's funding cuts affect the list next year, the data for this year's list predates those announcements. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg, Karen.
Thanks, Michael. Time now for our Bloomberg Sports Update, and for that, we bring in John Stashower.
Thanks, Karen. Good Monday night to cap Week 3. Lions and Ravens in Baltimore tied at 7, then 14, then 21, and then Detroit pulled away and won 38-30. David Montgomery, 151 rushing yards. He had 2 touchdowns, so did Jahmyr Gibbs. Lamar Jackson threw 3 touchdown passes in defeat, but he got sacked 7 times. So the Lions won. Now let's see what the Tigers do. They had a 12-game lead on the Guardians in late August. The Guardians with a 10-game winning streak. They're now only 1 game out. They host the Tigers tonight. That's your Bloomberg Sports Update.
Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak coming up after this.
coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
I want to get more now on some of the top stories we're covering this morning, including Walt Disney's announcement that Jimmy Kimmel Live will be live once again tonight. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Jill Desis. And Jill, of course, we saw some of the backlash surrounding Disney's decision to pull the show after there was some pressure from the FCC. What's Disney saying about what's got it to this place? Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Nathan. So what Disney said in the aftermath of all of this is, now obviously Jimmy Kimmel is preparing to return to air, is that they made this decision to suspend production on the show, quote, to avoid further inflaming a tense situation at an emotional moment for our country. That's the quote from Disney that they put out on Monday. This, of course, relates to some comments that Jimmy Kimmel made on a show recently that were about the killing of the conservative activist Charlie Kirk. That's really kind of become a really severe political flashpoint within the United States, pulling that show after, several of these large broadcasters pulled that show. What we understand now is that Jimmy Kimmel actually talked personally with Disney CEO Bob Iger about his return. He will be returning to the air tonight, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every single broadcaster is automatically following suit. Sinclair, actually, I think, as we've been discussing, that's the largest owner of ABC TV stations, has said that it will continue to preempt Kimmel's show. So again, this continues to be a developing story, but we'll see how Jimmy Kimmel actually plans on addressing this when he returns to the air tonight.
Yeah, that'll certainly be a big development once we hear that latest monologue following what we heard, the last of what we heard from Jimmy Kimmel last week. Of course, some of the other big news this morning is the announcement from the Trump administration linking Tylenol to autism, in pretty strong terms from President Trump, even stronger terms maybe than his own government.
Yes, I think this was, really, really significant development, obviously, out of the Trump administration, where you did have Donald Trump saying himself that Tylenol is, quote, not good. So he was giving this recommendation. He's saying about limiting or recommending that women limit the use of Tylenol. This has obviously caused quite a bit of controversy, particularly within the medical community. There have been attempts, I think, as we've been discussing for years now, to potentially link autism to Tylenol. Acetaminophen, that's the active ingredient in Tylenol, or other, causes. There's not really any sort of clear cause for the development of autism. And while we've seen, there's one study that potentially, sort of created a correlation there. There's really no clear causation there. So this has actually been met with some pretty strong condemnation from the medical community. I think, one of the really key things to keep in mind when you're looking at this particular announcement from the Trump administration is that a lot of scientists are warning that if fevers are untreated, so if women aren't taking something like a Tylenol or something else that can sort of alleviate that particular symptom, that could actually expose women and their babies to greater risks. So I think, it's really important to really kind of, clarify that this is something that's been met with a lot of condemnation from scientists.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.